Hello, good evening and welcome to Newsfirst Review 360. This week, the southwest monsoon triggered floods and threatened landslides across much of the country, with the number of affected inching over 100,000. Last time, when disaster struck, inadequate emergency preparedness was blamed for the loss of hundreds of lives. Was Sri Lanka better prepared this time? Meanwhile, on the geopolitical front, amidst accusations of luring Sri Lanka into a debt trap and grabbing territory, China has sought to dispel these fears and has reassured Sri Lanka of its commitment towards the country's progress. Later on in the show, we'll be joined by Subhashini Abesinghe of Verite Research. We'll be talking about free trade agreements. Also tonight on Speak Your Mind, we have the views expressed by Professor Ricardo Hausmann on liberalizing migrant policies. Let's take a look at our top stories this week.
The southwest monsoon rains and the devastation it has created shows how climate change has become an undeniable and significant challenge for sustainable development in Sri Lanka. The Institute of Policy Studies says Sri Lanka is faced with three major climate changes, and they are gradual increase in ambient air temperature, changes in distribution patterns. According to UN agencies, 96% of disasters in Sri Lanka are caused by climate such as flooding, landslides, extreme winds and drought. The Global Climate Risk Index 2018 ranked Sri Lanka as the fourth most climate change affected country in 2016. All major economic sectors of Sri Lanka are vulnerable to impacts of climate change, especially the poor. The recurrent style of floods and drought continues to cause severe household, economic and social stress in Sri Lanka. The Institute of Policy Studies says for better climate adaptation, comprehensive research based on inputs are vital.
Climate change has delivered an urgent call for us to improve our knowledge of the vast areas and the dynamic ecosystems they host. Proper research and reflection now is going to be vital if we are to successfully comprehend and respond to this great challenge to humanity and the ecosystem we inhabit.
Amid worsening monsoon rains that have triggered floods and threatened landslides across the country, the Australian government, the World Food Programme and UNICEF have joined hands to support Sri Lanka better prepare and respond to natural disasters. Linking a 3-year partnership with a funding of around 89 million rupees, Australia, the World Food Programme and UNICEF said Sri Lanka needs stronger disaster preparedness and response to combat climate change. The partnership aims to target the most vulnerable districts which are adversely affected by recurrent annual monsoons, including Ratnapura, Kalutara, Galle, Mathara, Kurunegala, Puttlam, Anuradhapura, Mullaitivu and Batticaloa. Under the partnership, 25,000 severely affected people will receive assistance through UNICEF and WFP, especially children, adolescents and pregnant mothers. The assistance will include food security and nutrition and child protection. China moved to dispel both local and foreign concerns that its investment in Sri Lanka is leading the island to a debt trap. Addressing a symposium on the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese ambassador denied that China was pushing Sri Lanka towards a debt trap with its financing.
Actually, in recent years, China has provided a substantial financial support to Sri Lanka's national construction projects, which are required by the Sri Lankan government in accordance with the development need. Actually, they all have been assessed by relevant Chinese authorities and reached to agreements through consultation. As for the commercial agreements or those loans agreements, they are actually in line with the principle of extensive consultation, joint contribution and shared benefits. And actually the relevant commercial contracts and loan agreements, they are signed on the basis of equity, reciprocity and mutual respect, and considering Sri Lanka's development need and the government's repayment capacity. is totally in line with Sri Lankan's development interest. In particular, a large number of China's loans to Sri Lanka were concessionary loans with relatively low interest rate and a long repayment period and some grace period. These loans all have gone to support the key projects with large capital requirement. For instance, the Colombo Outer Circus Expressway, the extension of the Southern Expressway, the Southern Railway project, and the project, the first section of the Central Highway, as Sri Lankan's true friend, China sincerely hoped that Sri Lanka could realize its national development and economic prosperity as soon as possible.
Stay tuned to Biz First Review 360. On the other side, we'll be joined by independent trade expert Subhashini Abesinghe to talk about free trade agreements, the benefits and the detriment. Welcome back to the program. There's a lot of misinformation and accusations and controversy surrounding free trade agreements that has come to the fore once again with the Sri Lanka-Singapore free trade agreement that was signed in January this year following about 18 months of negotiations. We've seen this become a common trend whenever free trade agreements come up, with CEPA, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement with India, which was being discussed under the previous regime, and also with EDCA, the Economic and Technology Cooperation Agreement, which is being discussed with India under this government. And now we have a whole slew of free trade agreements that are in the pipeline, including with China and the one that is just being signed with Singapore. What are free trade agreements and how do they help a developing country like Sri Lanka? To talk about this and more, we're joined by Subhashini Abesinghe, Research Director at Verite Research. Subhashini, thank you very much for coming here and trying to clarify a lot of the rumors and the myths and to present facts on these FTAs. Let me start by asking, in the interest of, for the common man, I shouldn't say the common man, but for the layperson listening in on the show, the layperson watching the show, what is a free trade agreement essentially? What does it do for a country?
So when we talk about free trade agreements, first thing that everyone should understand is these agreements actually are not about free trade. So none of the free trade agreements that is in existence today is actually about completely free trade. So they are more about regulated trade and more about bringing down trade barriers at the level of comfort of each country. So there are over 600 trade agreements signed in the world, and almost every country in the world has a free trade agreement. And some of our East Asian neighbors have over 10 agreements signed with different countries. So why do countries sign free trade agreements? So basically it is about when you try to export to another country, if you are exporting goods, you frequently encounter what you call generally import duty or import tariff. And what happens is these import tariffs makes your products less competitive compared to the products produced in that country. And what you're trying through the free trade agreement is what you call market access. You're thinking, maybe our exporters will do better if they don't have to pay this import duty. They will succeed better in that country, and they will be more competitive. And then you have something called non-tariff barriers, which is all about various permits, licenses, and various other requirements that sometimes can take longer time and be maybe an added burden. And you also try to think, can we also address some of the non-tariff barriers that our companies face in those other countries? So it's all about bringing down trade barriers that you face in another country. And today we are also talking about barriers to services supply. That is, if I want to open a bank in another country, what are my restrictions? If I want to open an insurance company in another country, what are my restrictions? So basically, and also restrictions about investment. So today trade agreements is like, normally when we people talk about trade, they always think about exporting goods and importing goods, but today's trade agreements go far beyond, and they also talk about trade-related other factors. For example, intellectual property. When I'm exporting a fashion garment that has certain design, certain brand, can I prevent other people selling other fake products and misuse my brand image, misuse my industrial designs, misuse my fashion designs? This is what is called intellectual property. So people include various other regulatory aspects as well into the agreement. So they are more about partly regulations, making sure there is far greater predictability and transparency, at the same time seeing how we can improve, reduce barriers.
So basically, at the end of the day, what FTAs do is they create an environment between the two parties to the agreement,
facilitate
between the two countries.
Trade.
Create an environment that's conducive to business.
Exactly. So that is one of the objectives. So, but there are other countries, larger countries like China, United States, sometimes might sign free trade agreements with other countries for political reasons. So they feel that this country is an important political ally, and I would like to give market access to my market, so that I find this particular country's support in certain initiatives, certain forums is important for me. So sometimes, especially large countries like China, United States, European Union, might sign agreements not because they're interested in that country's market, but because they feel it's politically and strategically important. But also there are some smaller countries that sign free trade agreements to basically what we call economically to lock in reforms. For example, a lot of people say when Mexico signed the NAFTA, they also wanted to use NAFTA to actually reform some of their institutions, regulations, and to improve their efficiencies and systems. And when Eastern European countries joined European Union, one of the objectives is, of course, common market of Europe is very important and appealing, but in addition to that, they also wanted to use these agreements to reform some of their inefficient institutions and inefficient regulations.
Is this what Sri Lanka is doing as well? I mean, under the current government, is this what they're hoping to achieve through these free trade agreements? That in addition to sort of opening up market access in Singapore, in China, in India, etc., that these agreements will also serve to reform our policies here at home?
So when you are signing with developed countries, that is one of the objectives. But if you are signing with India and China, it is largely market access, because these are very large markets where Sri Lanka's exports are not doing that great, and they don't go far. They're not very comprehensive in other regulatory aspects. But if you're signing with United States or European Union, the lock-in reform objective will be an important aspect, but not necessarily if you're negotiating with a developing country.
The last time that you were on the show, you were talking about the barriers within Sri Lanka itself, internal barriers that we have to trade that are preventing business from sort of growing. This included areas like customs and beyond. It's been a few months now. Do you feel that the country has made any progress in addressing this? We saw, for example, the Anti-Dumping and Countervailing Act that was passed in Parliament, which many economists have touted as landmark legislation. I judge from your facial expression that you disagree.
Yes, so that's a very interesting question, because that has been one of my positions about free trade agreements in general, is that in Sri Lanka we exaggerate both benefits and costs. So from the government side and from some of the proponents, I find that we think that this can be a silver bullet that can sort of address our export problems. Sri Lanka has been lagging behind the rest of the world in terms of growing exports. Our export, we all know that our exports diversification has been extremely bad. We depend on few products where we are fast losing competitiveness. And our exports have been growing far slower. One simple example that I think maybe you have also heard in different shows, people saying, comparing Vietnam and Sri Lanka. So Vietnam also exported $2 billion of worth of goods in 1990, and Sri Lanka was at the same stage. We had $2 billion worth of exports. And today, after 27 years, Vietnam is exporting $214 billion worth of goods, whereas Sri Lanka is exporting $11 billion. So Vietnam saw an 89 times increase. Vietnam managed to increase by 89 times their exports in 27 years, and Sri Lanka just by 6 times.
What was the difference? What was the key factor? Was it greater diversity in what Vietnam was exporting as compared to Sri Lanka? Was it the number of free trade agreements that they had signed? What was the factor that made the difference?
This is the critical question that you asked earlier about barriers to trade and investment that Sri Lanka has inside its own borders. So a good example is that Vietnam in the last decade got $9 billion worth of FDI per year, and Sri Lanka is struggling to reach 1 billion all the time, right? So one of the ways we can diversify and improve our competitiveness by attracting foreign direct investments and getting global companies to start production, manufacturing in our country. And that is something Vietnam very successfully did. And why would people want to go and invest in a particular country? You do have like these resources like low-cost labor, all of that, but not only that. It is largely how easy is it to invest and how transparent is your investment regulations, how predictable is your macroeconomic environment, how your political stability. Basically, all these companies look for these things which does not necessarily exist in Sri Lanka. So our complex and time-consuming investment approval processes and lack of transparency and existence of corruption really discourages investors to come into Sri Lanka. So free trade agreements will not resolve this problem. Free trade agreements can, however, be an added benefit if you do have your internal processes and systems right. So for example, Vietnam has over 10 agreements. It has an agreement with European Union, it has an agreement with China, it's part of ASEAN, and through ASEAN it has an agreement with India, and it was a member of Trans-Pacific Partnership as well. So Vietnam is very bullish about trade agreements because it has the ability to attract investments and it has a diversified and a competitive product portfolio.
One of the arguments that opponents to the Sri Lanka-Singapore Free Trade Agreement and even EDCA before that, one of the arguments they put forward is that you should not enter into a bilateral trade agreement with a more powerful country when you do not have your own house in order. Do you agree with that position? Do you feel that we should hold off on entering into trade agreements until we accomplish the reforms that you're speaking about? Or do you think that waiting for that is like waiting for the sky to fall on your head?
So basically free trade agreements will have marginal benefits unless we actually focus on improving our capacity and competitiveness of products and services, right? But at the same time, when people say your house in order, it can mean different things. Are you saying you need to introduce regulations that will restrict foreign companies or foreign nationals from coming into Sri Lanka? That is, I'm not quite sure whether that's putting your house in order. But what you really need is greater transparency, greater efficiency, ability to like reducing bureaucratic red tape. Most of our research shows that dealing with bureaucracy and bureaucratic inefficiencies, whether you want to get a permit, approval, that is an enormous cost that discourages investors and also that undermines competitiveness of firms. And that is exactly why we've always said, like, cleaning your own border, basically making sure that your border agencies are not an additional burden or a barrier for your ability to export to the world. So we've talked a lot about this single window, automating our systems, and we have every successive government has promised traders an automated border procedures for decades. And now we
and
have
that's not
fresh.
happened.
It has not happened. So whereas other countries, we all know why Singapore is at the top, because Singapore is one of the first countries to understand the importance of having good institutions, good systems, and using technology to improve efficiency. But Sri Lanka has lagged behind considerably, so that is why you can go ahead and sign 10 different agreements, but if you are not really addressing your supply side constraints, you will really not be able to benefit from the market access opportunities.
Thank you very much, Subhashini. On that note, we'll go in for a short commercial break. When we come back, though, we'll take a closer look at the Sri Lanka-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. Welcome back to the program. We're in conversation with Subhashini Abesinghe, Research Director at Verite Research. We're talking about free trade agreements. Subhashini, there's been a lot of fear-mongering, some would say, regarding the Sri Lanka-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, where there's these fears that have been expressed of a flood of people, of Indians and Chinese, using Singapore as a backdoor to enter Sri Lanka and the lucrative opportunities that we have in Sri Lanka. What do you have to say to these fears that have been raised by professional bodies? Is there any validity to this?
So one of the things I really want to emphasize is, as public, when we listen to politicians or any other stakeholder making this kind of statements, we need to carefully also be able to read between the lines and understand the political context within which we are operating, and the gains that people have to basically get by exploiting some of the existing fears of people. So look at Singapore. Singapore is one of the most developed countries in the world, and it has very high income levels. It has very good facilities in terms of whether you take health, education, transport, and the Singapore Free Trade Agreement specifically says that a movement of people is allowed. One thing is for Singapore nationals. So if an Indian or a Chinese or any other nationality becomes a national of Singapore with an opportunity to work and earn and live in Singapore, for us to even imagine that when you have an opportunity to live in Singapore, work in Singapore, and enjoy the benefits of being in a developed country, that you would want to actually use that citizenship to come to Sri Lanka, where the facilities are far poor than what you have in Singapore. Your salaries and wages will be much less than what you get in Singapore. So I think as public we need to really carefully think about it. And also Singapore is one of the most efficient countries in terms of institutions and regulations, where it's not easy for anybody to become a citizen. And also, while we say that Singapore nationals can come into Sri Lanka under this agreement, it is important to emphasize the agreement gives the ability to come in only to two categories of people. See, for anyone who's interested in looking at the agreement is available in the Ministry of International Trade website. And also, if you don't trust what Sri Lankan ministry is saying, if you feel, okay, they're going publishing one thing but doing another thing, go to the Singapore government website, because Singapore government website also has made the same agreement available.
Were there gaps in the negotiating process? Now, we've seen some professional bodies have highlighted the fact that, look, it says, the agreement, for example, will say that it's only at management level and it's only at this thing, but that there are problems when it comes to screening professional qualifications. Do you see any gaps of this sort? So
that is why it's important to understand who is allowed under this agreement. One is what we call a business visitor, is given a 30-day visa. Who is a business visitor? It's a potential investor who's coming to Sri Lanka to look, is there investment opportunity? A potential buyer of Sri Lankan products. So someone who wants to see, is there a business opportunity in Sri Lanka? And even currently, if a country thinks giving business visitors 30-day visa is a problem, then we must forget about foreign investments altogether, right? So that's one category. The second category is what we call intra-corporate transferees. Who are these people? It's a national of Singapore who is working currently in a Singaporean company that has invested in Sri Lanka. So the company is registered in Singapore, and that company has a branch or an office in Sri Lanka.
And this person is already working?
Yeah, already working, and he must have been working for a 1-year period, and he must have a minimum of 5 years experience in that field, and he must belong to a category of, like you said, a manager, executive, or a specialist. And he can temporarily come into Sri Lanka to work in the branch or office that Singaporean company has invested in for a period of 2 years with the ability of renewing his visa for a period of 5 years. Also, it's very important in this time to think, if I'm a Singapore company invested in Sri Lanka, the salary I have to pay for a manager I bring down from Singapore versus a salary I have to pay for a manager in Sri Lanka. If I can find competent, skilled person in Sri Lanka who is willing to work at a lower salary, does it make business sense at all for me to get the airfare, accommodation, maybe in some instances even family, to come into Sri Lanka and bear all that cost and pay a higher salary to bring a Singapore executive? So we must be very critical and rational in asking, when we listen to these statements, to see how valid are these statements.
Thank you very much, Subhashini. Truly a very enlightening and critical and rational look at free trade agreements. So FTAs, we leave that for you to decide. Be critical, be rational. All of this hot air surrounding free trade agreements, is it much ado about nothing at all? On that subject of being critical and rational, up next we have on Speak Your Mind Professor Ricardo Hausmann, who said recently, with the talent you have the country you have. But with the talent you have, you cannot have the country you want to have. Professor Hausmann is up next on Speak Your Mind.
We have done a growth diagnostic of Sri Lanka precisely to ask the question, what are the binding constraints to Sri Lankan growth? And we think that they have to do with the dynamics of exports, and we think that it has to do with the fact that things that could have happened didn't happen. That after garments, you didn't get into electronics, and you didn't get into machinery. Maybe because at the time that everybody was getting into electronics and into machinery, you had a civil war going on, and sort of like those investors never came, right? But I think that those innovations tend to occur by people who arrive in place with a know-how that the place didn't have. So I do believe that immigration is relatively critical to this problem that I think is the binding constraint that has to do with the export diversification.